Good morning. It's time once again for us to continue our study of 1 Peter. Open your Bibles to chapter 4. I hope that what we've got to study today really speaks to you as clearly as it does to me about the times that we're in. Probably more clearly than any other place in 1 Peter, we see situations and circumstances described here that are similar to what we live in today. As you're turning there, I wonder if you'd think with me about one word, to describe the times that we're in, to describe the circumstances that we're in. Now, I know it'd be great if this were a Zoom call, or maybe it wouldn't be. I've been on plenty of those, certainly over the last several months. But it would be great to have some give and take, some exchange, some feedback that we're so missing. And I'd like to hear from some of you that might answer this question. From Barbara Gregory that might sound off on this question and give me a one-word answer that describes the times we're in, or Ashley Tucker, or any number of you in an audience today that might share with me your thoughts. I don't know what words you'd land on. Maybe a word like struggles, maybe a word like strange. These times that we're in are strange and they're full of struggles. I don't know what words you'd land on today, but chapter 4 speaks about the times that the first century Christians were in there and what they should be prepared for and the way that they should live. Something that's caught a lot of traction over the last several months is the idea that maybe the doomsday preppers had it right. Maybe these people who have built bunkers for themselves or converted old silos into some sort of survival apparatus. Maybe those people had it right. I don't know, but certainly we're living in interesting and strange times. Open your Bibles, if you would, to 1 Peter chapter 4, starting in verse 1. And follow along with me there. Therefore, since Christ suffered in the body, arm yourselves also with the same attitude. The same attitude, or maybe your translation says the same mind of Christ. We are called to have the same commitment that Jesus had in enduring the suffering that he endured on our behalf on the cross. Jesus said as much in Matthew chapter 16 and verse 24 when he said, anyone who comes after me must be prepared to deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. We have to be committed as Jesus was committed. It describes it clearly there in the beginning of this chapter, the level of commitment that we as Christians should have to enduring the suffering that we're going to endure. Now, I don't know whether or not you find yourself suffering in this time we're in, but they are strange times that take a lot of getting used to. I'm ready to climb the wall. The person in my family that spent more time at home is now away from home the most, and the person that was away from home the most is now at home the most. In the time that we've been in quarantine or in this isolation, I've had a child move out and buy their first home. These are really peculiar times that we're struggling to kind of come to grips with and to figure out and to get comfortable with. I don't know that we can get comfortable with them. We've spent enough time getting comfortable, and he speaks to that point here in a minute. It's hard to have the same attitude as Christ in our battle with sin because we refuse to sacrifice anything in the fight. We refuse to sacrifice in the fight against sin. We only want to be victorious if that victory comes in an easy confrontation, in an easy conflict with sin. We don't want to sacrifice, but Jesus calls us to sacrifice directly in Matthew chapter 5. Jump over to Matthew chapter 5, if you would, starting in verse 29, and we'll read 29 and 30. So Matthew chapter 5, 29 and 30. Here Jesus calls us to sacrifice if it's necessary. Chapter 5, verses 29 and 30. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Here, it's Jesus speaking very specifically about the need to sacrifice in the fight against sin. That this struggle that we're in now with coronavirus is something, but our real struggle is our struggle that we have against sin. And he expounds on that later, Peter does. But in that fight against sin, we have to be prepared for sacrifice. We have to be prepared to give up something. Now, what God would like us to give up certainly is the sin, but we have to be prepared to give up whatever we have to give up in order to win and be victorious in our battle against sin. It later describes, and go on and read with me, verse 2. Actually, let's reread verses 1 and 2. Therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourselves also with the same attitude, because he who has suffered in his body is done with sin. As a result, he does not live the rest of his earthly life for evil human desires, but rather for the will of God. It describes the kind of person who is a victorious sufferer here in the latter part of verse 1, and it goes on to describe him in verse 2. But he who suffers for doing right has made a permanent break from sin. The person who suffers for his God, for his righteousness, is somebody that is done with sin. That passage describes the spiritual state of the victorious sufferer. He goes on to say and account these different sins, these things that I find fascinating. Let's read starting in verse 3. For you have spent enough time in the past doing what pagans choose to do, living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and detestable idolatry. They think it strange that you do not plunge with them into the same flood of dissipation. And it's interesting when he lists these 7 things that, they used to live like, the ways that they used to live before they came to know Christ, before they became obedient to the gospel. He's describing things that fallen man has struggled with, and it really hasn't changed for the last nearly 2,000 years. They list these sins, and really they're the same sins that people struggle with today. He uses the word dissipation, a word meaning wastefulness. And a life in pursuit of gratifying the flesh is a life that's truly wasted. Think about what you think or how you respond to wastefulness. Sometimes you'll reassess where you are with things. And during this time, I've had the opportunity to reassess, what I was paying for insurance, for instance. And what I discovered whenever I reassessed was I was wasting money. I also, through the good counsel of good friends, decided to look at my television service and see if there was a better option for me out there. And I'm not going to advertise for one thing or against another, but I did select something that was different than what I had before, and it was incredible the amount of waste that I had. Waste is just such a sad thing. Missy bought me a new smoker for Father's Day, and I have smoked so many things and have been alone here that unfortunately and regrettably there's been some waste. I've taken food over to my neighbor. Of course, that's not waste, but even between he and I trying to consume what I've smoked, I've managed to have some waste. Waste is such a shame, and it's such a shame whenever what we're wasting is the gift of our life that God has given us. What we're wasting is the time that we have here on earth to further the gospel. What we're wasting is the grace that God has shown upon us. So I think it's an interesting reading here, but he goes on to say that he describes it that they think it's strange that you don't plunge yourself into the same flood of this wastefulness. These people who waste their life pursuing flesh think it's strange that you don't do the same thing. In these strange times that we're in, we need to evaluate that we're called to live a strange life, doing things that the world around us might see as strange. This last week, I went and played Top Golf. And in fact, I've been a couple of times in the last few weeks and had a really good time. And I was reminded of something while I was playing Top Golf. I am not a regular golfer. In fact, 10 years ago, I was on a team that won a scrambles golf tournament at Walmart, and we won, and I got a trophy, and I decided that at that point I would retire from golf and go out on top. And until then, the only time I had ever played golf was on a game on my phone. I hadn't done any more golf since then. But the other day when we were at Top Golf, I was reminded of the fact that I'm terrible with my driver. I'm really terrible with everything except for the clubs 7, 8, and 9. For some reason, I can really reach out and touch some things with those 3 clubs. And I was reminded of a friend of mine who had the same problem where he couldn't do anything with his driver or his long irons, and he could do stuff with his short irons. And as a result, he just committed to playing only with 7, 8, 9, and putter. And so it was easy. He didn't even have to have a bag, really. He just carried 4 clubs with him and was on his way. And I remember playing with him one time, and he just got immensely ridiculed. He was made fun of, mocked, and laughed at all over the golf course. Now, the amazing thing was there were 5 of us playing golf that day, and he managed to come in second in the group of 5. The people, and he beat me soundly with just a 7, 8, and 9 iron and a putter. The people who view us as doing something strange, sometimes, well, not sometimes, every time, and he describes it here later, but every time we're going to have to be called to account for the life that they led, for the life that they lived, and the fact that maybe it wasn't as strange as it needed to be. Maybe it wasn't the strange kind of obedience that they had rejected. It says in verse 5, but they will have to give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. Giving account. Being called to answer for what happened with the time that you had. In the summer, my mother used to work whenever I was a young kid and in elementary school and in junior high, and she used to leave us these things to do on a notepad called Things to Do. I've talked about this before because it really marked my life and scarred me. In fact, my mother still now at 81 has the same pads. I don't know where she got the quantity of these pads that she got, but she still has them. She's not run out even now. These Things to Do pads had a list of 5, 6, sometimes 10 items with the name of the child and the things that were supposed to be done. There was a little box that you could check off and leave. And what she would do is leave them on the counter in the morning when she left for work, and she would expect that they would be back on the counter in the evening when she got home, and she could go by and make sure that all of those things were indeed done. What was very obvious when my mother returned is how we spent our time. If she got back home and she walked around and looked, she would find that most of the things that she had asked me to do were done very hastily and only in the last, 30 minutes of time that we had before she arrived home. And she could tell I was called to account for the things that I should have been doing and the way that I had spent my time. I remember one time she came home and caught me raking the carpet. We had shag carpet in our house, and we had this plastic rake. And honestly, I felt like when you vacuumed the carpet, the real purpose of vacuuming was to make the carpet stand up. The idea of actually cleaning the carpet really never occurred to me, because this was the most god-awful, hideous shag carpet that you couldn't see a stain in it if there had been one. So I thought the purpose was to make the carpet stand up. So when I was asked to vacuum the house, I knew I could rake the carpet much faster, and it would look the way she wanted it to look. The carpet would be all extended and standing up. And she caught me doing that one time and noted that it was not on my list of things to do. Raking the carpet was not on my list. I was supposed to be vacuuming the carpet. There is going to be a time when these people who mock us for not, plunging into this flood of dissipation are called to answer for the time that they've wasted. Let us not be among those. He goes on to say in verse 4, "For this is the reason the gospel was preached even to those who are now dead, so that they might be judged according to men in regard to the body, but live according to God in regard to the Spirit." In verse 7, "The end of all things is near. Therefore be clear-minded and self-controlled so that you can pray." The end is near. He describes it as being near. We hear this other times in the New Testament, but here Peter describes the end as being near. And he encourages them to be clear-minded and self-controlled so that they'll be prepared to do the one thing that is what you do in end times. It's what you do when it's time to prep for doomsday, and that is pray. Here we are in what people are calling, catastrophic, awful, horrendous, and it is all those things here in our earthly time. But it's something that we as Christians can be, we have a mechanism to strengthen us, to encourage us, to prepare us for what's coming, and that is prayer. He encourages them to be clear-minded, self-controlled, so that they can pray. I'm encouraging you that throughout the course of the next several weeks that you really try to strengthen your prayer life during this difficult time, that you work on ways to pray more frequently, more fervently. I think you'll find that if you do that the struggles that we're dealing with and the things that are strange and unusual and trying right now will be a whole lot easier to live through and overcome. He goes on with some other additional great encouragement here in the following verses. I'm going to read them real quick through the end to verse 11. Here's his encouragement to how we should live with one another in these difficult times. "Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Each one should use whatever gift he has received to serve others, faithfully administering God's grace in its various forms. I'm going to stop right there for just a second. We are given the opportunity to administer God's grace. I mean, think about what he's saying there, that we get to be the vessel for God's grace. We get to be the conduit for God's grace. We get to be the instrument of God's grace. The things that we do are not us. They're God's grace pushed through us. We have the opportunity to be God's grace. In 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 10, Paul describes it this way. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace to me was not without effect. No, I worked harder than all of them, yet not I, but the grace of God that was with me. God's grace working through Paul, God's grace working through us. We get to be the mechanism of God's grace. Think about what a tremendous opportunity that is to touch others and to let them see God's grace in you. He goes on to say some other things that we get to be that are of God, and that's in verse 11. He says, if anyone speaks, he should do it as one speaking the very words of God. If anyone serves, he should do it with the strength God provides, so that in all things God may be praised through Jesus Christ. To him be the glory and the power forever and ever. Amen. He says, when it comes to living your life in these difficult end times, in these last times, that you should do it as an instrument of God's grace. You should also be God's mouth. The things that you should say should be God saying them through you. And you should do it with God's strength. The hand that you apply to help another should be the hand applied with God's strength. He is encouraging us to be God's grace, God's mouth, and God's strength. In these difficult times, the world needs more of God's grace, God's mouth, and God's strength. Think about the things that you do. Think about the things that you say. Think about the way that you interact with others and love others. If you're doing it this way, it certainly can beat back some of the difficult, trying things that we're experiencing right now, watching all around us. By doing this, God is praised. Now, in looking at chapter 4 and analyzing really, what he's telling us to do to prepare us for these difficult times that are on us and all around us, it reminds me that we have a say in the way that the end turns out. There are winners and there are losers, and we get to decide if we're going to be victorious. We get to decide if we're going to conquer sin. We get to decide if we're going to overcome. And he really spells out the recipe for how we should do that, the recipe for what that looks like, and how it should appear not only to us as we're living this way, but to others around us. We're encouraged to love in these times and love in these ways. I don't know what things are on your mind, what things have your heart heavy right now. There's plenty of things to choose from, it seems. I encourage you to try to find the joy in the opportunities that we have to be home, that the opportunities that we have to be with our family. Over the course of the last several days, I've had the opportunity to work outside on my deck. And just that, and the peace that provides, listening to the birds sing and the other little critters run around, smelling smoke constantly coming out of the smoker that Missy gave me again. Thank you, Missy, for the Father's Day gift. But we have the opportunity to improve the situation that we're in. He describes it here in chapter 4 in the greater context, but we have the opportunity to improve the situation that we're in right now, today. And I hope that you're utilizing those tools that Peter's describing here in 1 Peter to improve your situation and to make things better a little bit at a time. Just a little bit at a time. I had a friend that used to say, whenever I described how big a problem was that I was dealing with and how paralyzed I was at that problem. Some of us may describe the sin problem that we struggle with that way. Some of us may describe just the earthly problems that seem to be everywhere and so prevalent that way as well. And he used to say the same solution every time, that you consume an elephant one bite at a time, and you just have to put your head down and get to work. Right now, there seems to be so many things that are not right, and it would be real easy to just give up and plunge into that wasteful dissipation that he talks about here in chapter 4 and verse 3. But what he's describing that we should do instead is use the time that we have to extend grace like God, to speak like God, and to utilize God's strength. And with those three super godly powers, we can overcome an awful lot of what the world throws at us. I hope this week that you're encouraged by what we talked about. I hope that you're reading ahead in chapter 4 and prepared to talk to more next week regarding it. Thanks again for tuning into class. I'm praying for you. I'm thinking about you. I can't wait to see you. I do appreciate the calls and cards and comments that many of you have shared, so keep those coming. It's an encouragement to me.